All right, everybody. Hello. Welcome again to From Awareness to Reconciliation, the second panel. And for those of you connecting now to the conversation, I wanted to say something that I said at the beginning of the previous conversation, and that's the following. And I'm hoping that these words work as a way to encourage you to take action. The conversations that we're having today feel natural to me as a human and as a person that cares for others. But this is not my area of expertise. And I said it at the beginning of the last conversation, and I'm going to say it again now. My heart is bumping a little faster than it normally does because I feel that we're talking about something that is helping me learn, but pushing me pretty far out of my zone of comfort, if you will. And what I mean by this, and I want to encourage you, is that even when it feels somewhat either uncomfortable or something that you don't know much about, you can educate yourself and take action. That's ultimately what I'm trying to say here. You start by educating yourself, and that's why the name of this chat today is From Awareness to Reconciliation. You start by becoming more aware of what's going on, and you start taking action. Even when taking action can feel a little bit uncomfortable. That means that you may be going even in a great path to generate this powerful conversation at work. So once again, for those of you who are connected here, please let us know where you are connecting from. I know there is a lot of stuff going on in the chat, and I apologize. I'm managing the technology, moderating the panel. There's one thing that I'm gonna have to let go, which is reading all the comments in the chat, but please continue engaging in the conversation with your fellow, with the community connected on this chat today. I'm very, very happy to have Liz Adams, Garrison Gibbons, Dana Brownlee, and Michael Erisman. I hope that, I don't know if Shane will connect. We have one more panelist. Maybe he connects a little later. But very thankful with all of you for being connected today to this conversation. During the first panel, we started talking about the role of HR leaders in the conversation about racism and anti-racism in the workplace, in the conversation from discrimination to reconciliation and unity, in the conversation from hate to love, all coming down to becoming more aware on how to do it, but also taking action. So I'm going to start right off the bat with this question. What, right now, all the things that are happening in America, which are repeated all too often in America, but also all over the world, what do you say to HR leaders? When they come to you and they say, I want to do something about this, but they are not sure what to do. What do you say to them? Open question to anybody who wants to jump in. I know I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think about it.
I'll jump in. First off, this is Liz. I just want to say thank you for having this conversation. Thank you for creating the space for us to have these courageous conversations. They haven't been easy. The last 2 weeks have not been easy for me. I am in Minneapolis. They haven't been easy for my community. They haven't been easy for my colleagues. They haven't been easy for my fellowship cohorts or any of the city community members that I'm associated with. So first off, just thank you for that. But from an HR perspective, I would say that there's an article out on CNN. It talks about what CEOs and managers can do for, specifically Black employees, because that's the perspective that I'm coming from with everything that has happened. And there's a number of things that I think are important. And you talked about racism, anti-racism. I think there's a third piece in there, and it's about being complicit. And what does that mean in this conversation? So a lot of people can say they're not racist and they can demonstrate that, but also there's this piece, like, as I mentioned, about being complicit. So when something happens, people are not speaking up. And I have been bombarded by my good friends and neighbors telling me how they wish they could have done more. And I will say it's encouraging, but it's also disheartening to know that I've shared space with these people, dinner and drinks, and did things with their children, to know that they didn't speak up when they could have. So first off, I'd say acknowledge reality and then take a look at that article. So those are my kinds of initial thoughts.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. Michael, I want to turn it over to you. You've had a long and an amazing career leading HR. And you probably have seen a little bit of everything in the workplace. And You probably have dealt with a lot of difficult conversations. What do you say to HR leaders when they feel uncomfortable by talking about something that for some of them may feel as a political conversation and not as a human conversation, which it is? It's not a Republican versus Democrat, it's just a human conversation. Mm-hmm. What do you say to them that may feel a little uncomfortable with bringing this conversation to the table in these times of polarized, of our polarized society?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me, Enrique. Liz, I appreciated what you had to say as well. And thank you for sharing. This is sadly not the first time that we've been through this. This has happened a couple of times, and I've certainly have dealt with this in the past before. And the first thing I would say is you need to lean in and be authentic. And you need to allow people the space to speak. And that's not always easy in a workplace where you're trying to get something accomplished and you're trying to produce products or whatever it is that you're trying to do. But you have to allow people space to talk, and you have to allow people space so you can listen to what they're hearing. And I think as HR professionals, occasionally we miss that. There's been a push over the last 10, 15 years or so to get very into the strategy of the business. But the reality is that we are fundamentally about the people implications of our organizations. What does it mean to our employees? What does it mean to them and their families? What are they experiencing every day? We have to tap into that. We have to spend the time and create the space to listen. And then we have to have the courage and conviction to ensure that our leaders slow down in these times and take that space to listen. Because the reality is that if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're probably not doing anything. And we need to embrace the fact that we should be uncomfortable. This is, what we're trying to accomplish is something greater than ourselves. And we're trying to accomplish a level playing field. We're trying to change society in a lot of ways from without public policy, because many of us have no impact on public policy. But we can have an impact on where we work today, and we can do that every day. So I think number one, create the space and listen. Help your leaders to say, today's not the time to jump right into, what we have to accomplish today in terms of a task. Take some time and just go around the room and hear what people are feeling and what they're validate these feelings. And we don't do that enough. Yeah. And those are so critical, especially in times like this.
I love that you say that, Mike, because, Liz is in Minneapolis. And of course, I live in a very small town in Arizona where, some like 10 people are protesting out there, but that's pretty much it, right? So my reality, even for people who work in this town, is very different from the reality of people living in Minneapolis and Black people living in Minneapolis. So it's allowing that, humanity to just happen, right? Like, if you feel that you need some time, if you want to put together conversations at work, I think that's very powerful, together with what Liz said at the beginning, which is this puts you on a place of taking action and not just being silently complicit to what's happening. Dana, you work with several organizations, listening to the work that they're doing and supporting their strategies, their work and whatnot. What's a like, have you measured the temperature right now in the workplace? What's going on? What are business leaders doing? What are HR leaders doing? And can you share some of those stories with us here?
Yeah, ironically, that dovetails really nicely into what I was going to share as my response to what I would say to HR leaders. And the first thing would be to listen and to take the temperature of the organization. Because really what most organizations are looking at in terms of addressing racial injustice is changing the culture of the organization. And we all know that culture change does not happen overnight. I mean, that's a heavy lift. And so what that organization, may look like, Amazon, I'm sure looks very different than Bank of America, which looks probably very different than Boeing. And so every company is not the same. And even within a company, every particular team and organization is not the same. So I think the first order of business is really listening. The other reason why I think that's so important is to position ourselves for authentic conversation. Because I promise you, it's so funny. I posted the article on Forbes about Dear White People, 10 actions that white people can take to address racial injustice. So interesting. I posted it. I'm a Black female. what came in on my social media feed was not the same as what came in on a white colleague's social media feed. And it was so great for me to be a fly on the wall, even though it's public, to see the difference in some of what they were talking about versus what, you know, people were saying to me. And I even had several white women reach out to me who I don't know, to be honest and say, hey, in this moment, I'm confused. I feel like I'm getting mixed messages. In one sense, they're saying, get out here, you need to do it, you need to do more. But then as soon as I start to do something, they're looking at me like, why are you here? This ain't about you. You know, you need to get in your place. You need to hand the microphone to a Black person. And I think that needs voice as well, because I really don't think we move forward until we can have authentic conversation and authentic understanding of what we're really thinking in this moment.
I absolutely love that you're bringing that to the table. I have this experience, you know, like about 3 years ago, I wanted to put together a panel on, you know, it was not called that way, but it was, you know, to help, you know, mid-career women to get to the leadership positions in HR. And I only wanted to invite women. And my co-organizer said to me, that's a mistake, you know, because you got to listen to, you know, also the men who are going to be owning some of the decision-making process, and some of whom are already sitting in those positions. So you got to bring this diverse panel. So I'm loving that you're saying that, because I'm Latino, you know, but I do feel that there are Latino, Asians, you know, white Americans, that they want to actively participate of the conversation, and they want to, you know, not only give their time, but act on it. And they may feel a little bit of, hello, and they may feel a little bit turned off sometimes because they don't know how to do it. So we're going to get into that conversation, and because it's going to be very, very important. Garrison, I know you wanted to add something to this idea on empowering, encouraging, inspiring, and pushing HR leaders to take action during this time.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Liz, you know, I've had a lot of managers reach out to me and ask, you know, how do I get more educated, or how do I speak on these issues? I feel like I'm uneducated on the issues as they pertain to race, and I don't know how to talk about it with my team. And I think, you know, my first response as someone who has taken the time to study and read books on privilege and read books on being an anti-racist, you know, I was a little bit frustrated because the resources are out there, and I think it, you know, demonstrates a lack of willingness, or the lack of desire to study this prior. So my first kind of job as an HR leader, because I didn't want them reaching out to Black employees or asking Black individuals that are close to them to do the work for them. So I took it on myself to really compile a list of resources. What are, you know, some of the books that I've read that I've appreciated? What are some books that people are suggesting that I haven't read? You know, what are some articles out there about, you know, how managers can do a better job? I know that some people are sharing that in the chat. So I really took it on as my job as an HR leader to provide that to our employees. So, you know, I think putting resources together could do a lot in terms of just letting people kind of educate themselves to a certain extent. I also agree that I think a lot of it has to do with talking about unconscious bias and some of the biases we have, and doing a diagnosis of your current organization and really coming to terms with what are kind of the top priorities you need to be doing in the area of DEI. There's obviously a lot that we can do. And so I think prioritizing what is most needed in your organization is important, and something that I think now kind of has the attention, similar to COVID, how HR kind of got the attention of the executives because it was an internal kind of people first leadership that was needed. I think diversity and inclusion leaders and or HR people that assume that role within their organization now have the attention and kind of can fight for the budget to do a lot of the things that maybe weren't greenlit before. And so I think taking advantage of that, but also really prioritizing what is the need is important, because I think a lot of leaders will immediately go to hiring
Yeah.
And as we know, in the diversity space, that's not always the best place to start. And so I think really educating yourself on DEI and where you need to start within your own organization is an important first step as well.
Thank you, Garrison. Shane, hello, how are you? Welcome to the panel. And I'm going to ask a different question now. Thank you for being here with us. And you know what, I want to take a second to once again welcome everybody who's connected on the conversation via LinkedIn Live. Once again, I apologize. I'm reading some of your comments, but I can't really follow up on all of them. And please continue putting your questions in there and talking to the rest of the community participating in this chat on LinkedIn Live. Shane, I gotta say, one of the things that scares me a little bit, I'm gonna use that word because it does, is that humanity seems to not really learn from past mistakes, right? We seem to be doing the same thing over and over and over again. And if you may remember, a couple of years ago, this happened not just a couple of years ago, but very often. What happened to George Floyd has happened before. This is not the first time. And we get into the energy of the moment, which is let's go out, let's protest police brutality, let's make changes in the in the police, let's police reform and laws and the workplace. And after 2 or 3 weeks, we go back to quote unquote normal, or maybe 5% better than normal, but not radically better than normal like it should be. How do we keep the momentum going forward? How do we keep the conversation on the table? How do we not forget about the things that are happening in our country now when it comes to discrimination and racism? And how do we continue inspiring people to talk about this, over time and not just when horrifying things happen?
That is an excellent and a large question. And hello, everyone. Sorry for running behind. I was using the wrong link. So bad millennial. But I think that to your question, how do we maintain the momentum? I think we, have to be cognizant of a few things. So part of what makes this moment especially powerful is that it's happening on top of a global pandemic. And let's actually register that for a moment, that from the period of, if we say COVID started to get really intensify around March to the present day, racism couldn't even sit down from March until October. That's how virulent an enemy it is. That's a very, very powerful sort of reality that we have to acknowledge. We also have to acknowledge that up until before all of this took place, we have 40 million people who are unemployed. So we have to understand that these are some of the conditions that have sort of brought us to a place where we have now reached a fever pitch. So I think understanding that context is critically important. And those are just but a couple, and there are plenty more. I think the next part about it is this very conversation, which I'm so excited to be a part of, is a part of that conversation around how do we maintain the momentum? And I think how we maintain the momentum is to get real, gritty, real, raw. One, not everybody needs to be vulnerable. Although for years we have done unconscious bias trainings, we've done microaggressions trainings, and those strategies are important, but those strategies focus on interpersonal dynamics. Interpersonal dynamics alone are not going to solve this problem. The problem of systemic racism requires systemic approaches and an intersectional lens. And by intersectional lenses, I mean solving for the most vulnerable will benefit everybody. That's really key and critical.
Go ahead, Shane, because I wanted to ask you one more question, but go ahead. I apologize.
No problem. And then the other part I think about it is that we also need to be sophisticated around what resistance looks like. Because those of us who've been doing this work for years, we have experienced tons of doublespeak. Oh, I'm all for equity, racial equity, but we can't reduce quality. Or as I used to hear when working in higher ed, I'm all for the free exchange of ideas, but but the canon is white men. Why is there so much, if you really value free exchange of ideas, why is there actually so much resistance to finding scholars of color and elevating and lifting those voices and incorporating them meaningfully into the curriculum? So to sort of summarize, I think we need to really understand the context of this moment, mobilize people in the manner that we need to. Not everybody needs to be vulnerable. Some people, we just need action. And then we also have to be understanding of what resistance looks like. And to elaborate on that, I think what HR leaders need to be prepared for is people are going to be filing complaints, and people are going to be looking at your track record of how you responded to EEOC or various complaints of bias, harassment, and discrimination within your organizations. Because there are some Black employees, some of them being my friends, who have sent me texts and they're like, wow, I cannot believe my organization put out a Black Lives Matter statement, but I'm already behind the scenes in an EOC investigation with them.
Yeah.
So I think
And
organizations
on
have
that,
to really be
there's
critical
an
in that
amazing,
regard.
Yeah.
and on that, just while we're talking about that, there's an amazing Fortune article out today called White Female Founders at Refinery, Reformation, and Others Face Reckoning on Racism. And it covers how different organizations have posted Black Lives Matter and how actually that's brought forward a lot of people like the Me Too movement. It's brought forward now this opportunity for people to file those complaints. And so I completely agree with Shane that that's going to be something we see an increase of due to kind of the now all of a sudden waking up to the idea of systemic racism in 2020 when we've been having these conversations for decades. I think that's going to be something that we definitely will be facing and experiencing over the next several months.
Absolutely. And Shane, I wanna write on your last, you read my mind, because the question that I wanted to ask you was about HR. And the way I see what's going on right now is we are an army of people trying to do the right thing, fighting in different battlegrounds. One battleground, of course, is out in the street, peacefully protesting to promote police reform and bring attention to systemic racism and injustice. That's on the street. We're also working at home. Many families talking about these things with their with their kids and their family members and whatnot. And of course, the workplace, which is where we spend 1/3 of our time. So if we focus right now on the workplace, what Michael was saying before, we need to take action as HR leaders. What would you all, and this is a question for everybody, what would you say should be a little playbook of 2 or 3 actionable insights that you can share with the HR leaders to start doing right now in the face of all that we're going through at the moment? So this is a question for everybody. Yeah, go.
I have a thought right now. So one thing that HR leaders need to be doing is get ready to receive these complaints. And the first thing out of your mouth had better not be, so-and-so didn't mean that. You need to receive these complaints thoughtfully, objectively, with a focus on gathering as much information as you need to ensure that people who are engaging with the process feel like the process is trustworthy and reliable. And the knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, I have a personal relationship with so-and-so, or they couldn't have possibly mean that, or you are, perhaps you need to just talk with them, that can come across as, quite frankly, racialized gaslighting.
Yeah.
And HR managers really need to be thoughtful around, if you're going to be holding this spot and people are going to be compensating you for your role, then you need to be able to field all manner of complaints and do your due diligence and investigate them and follow the processes accordingly. And don't be that roadblock that has people feeling like, I can't trust my company to do this, or I need to sort of be on my way out. Because there's ample information. Korn Ferry, Center for Talent Innovation, a lot of these organizations have published exquisite, I've read them myself, exquisite reports about the experience of Black employees and Black executives. So now is the time to sort of look back at what we already have and really sort of look at some of those strategies. But the first I would say is make sure to receive those complaints very, very thoughtfully. The other part I'll say too is that if your organization has not put out a statement, have a discussion about why that's the case. But secondly, if your organization has put down a statement, find out what touch point you're going to be providing to the Black employees in your organization. Paradigm, a Bay Area consulting firm, released a guide for managers and how they can support Black employees in that time. You leverage that as a resource. And then thirdly, think about how it is that you're going to really, once again, apply actions in a systemic and intersectional way. You can continue to do some of the work around unconscious bias and microaggressions, but absent a thoughtful, coordinated strategy, we're going to be back here again in 5 to 7 years.
Yeah. Thank you, Shane. That's very powerful. Liz, I know you wanted to add something to that to that end.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I will say when you talked about momentum is if you have Black voices at the table, then you won't need to worry about momentum. Because as a technologist, if you have a Black voice at the table as a technologist, then you won't have to worry about algorithmic bias, because a person will let you know that there's challenges with your technology, that you need to break it apart. You need to have some more ethics built in. So I would absolutely say you need to have more people of color, more voices at the table for some of these things. In addition, if your company is bringing in someone to kind of help unpack your HR, D&I stuff, pay them Pay for them and stop using free talent from your employees or from people that they know, and make sure that they are legitimized by you paying them. So I just wanted to add those, a couple of those things as well.
Yeah, just to add on to what Shane said as well, we have PR teams working overtime right now to try to come up with statements, and that's a good thing. Absolutely, Shane. I mean, I think it'll be telling for companies that don't do that, but let's not fool ourselves that is going to change the environment. That's PR, and PR is important, but we need to go look at what is actually happening in the workplace. So what I would tell you, if you're in HR, you need to start looking at other things like ancillary policies. Where do you hire people from? I've been in the tech business for 15 years. And let me tell you that you could do all the implicit bias training in the world, but tech companies hire only from the same schools and from the same locations. And what that does is that has limited the ability for people to be successful. You don't see a ton of tech companies on the West Coast hiring in North Carolina, putting offices in Chicago, putting offices in places where there can be more opportunity. We have to change that. And COVID has given us a great opportunity. What it showed is that you don't have to physically be in an office. You don't have to commute for 2 hours a day through traffic to an expensive city to be able to do your work, when in fact you can do it right from your house. We have to take advantage of that. That's an HR thing that we have to go to the table with and talk about, because a lot of our leaders have this antiquated idea that you have to be in the same place, you have to come from the same schools, you have to have similar experiences in order to be successful. If we don't tackle that, then this is not going to change, because we don't provide those opportunities. The other thing is to look at policies around things like parental leave. The US has the worst parental leave of any country in the world. And having worked, in 130 countries around the world myself, this is one of those areas that we have to go in and make a difference. We've got to make it so people don't have to choose between their job and their families. We have to figure out ways that people don't have to commute to expensive neighborhoods. These are things that we can do and we can change, because all the things that Liz has talked about, and Shane and Garrison, these things are all spot on, and we should do all of them. But there's fundamental ways our business is structured that if we're not at the table having those conversations, it's not going to happen. And it's going to, it's going to require some courage and conviction. Many of us in HR are going to have to say and ask ourselves, am I willing to lose my job to stand up for the right things? Because if you're not willing to do that, and trust me, as somebody who has done that in the past and has lost my job as a result of that, you have to be, looking back, you will never regret doing the right things, ever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
this is beyond, you can't prioritize. You can't say, this stuff is really important. But I got to make sure that, I don't rock the boat so I can get a promotion at some point, right? I mean, these things aren't going to work. So I would really encourage everyone listening in HR to be authentic, to take advantage of these opportunities, because if you're not the voice for these people, who will be?
Yeah.
Right. If I may chime in,
And
actually, to elaborate on
go ahead.
Michael's point, is I think to the point around sort of being like, what are you willing to sacrifice? I think parallel with the work of being an ally or being an accomplice, organizations, HR leaders need to critically interrogate how do their organizations, whether they're 10,000 plus people, global organizations, reify a culture of whiteness within the organization. Because if we think of white racial identity development and kind of the sheepishness around race, why then are we actually surprised that there are so many companies that are struggling to put together messages? Part of that is because white racial socialization is don't name race. The implicit idea of if you're non-white, that's not great. So organizations actually have to confront, if you're really global organizations, then there should be many cultural lenses that you're able to tap into readily as you think about your communication strategies, messaging, and the like. And also with regard to policies and protocols. I'll also give everyone a tip. So I know that How to Be an Anti-Racist is sold out with Ibram Kendi, as is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. But actually my favorite book for people to be reflective and think is this book called Good White People, The Problem with Middle-Class White Anti-Racism by a philosopher named Shannon Sullivan. It is not sold out yet. If anybody's still looking for it,
that is fantastic.
their thinking.
I want to turn it over. Thank you for sharing those resources, Shane. I want to turn it over to Dana. or Dana. She allowed me to say her name in the two different ways, just in case. And if you haven't noticed, I have an accent. So, but Dana, thank you for allowing me that flexibility with the name, but I know it's Dana.
Certainly.
I want to ask you and dig a little deeper into the role of HR. That's our main community is HR people, and I know they because they have told me that a lot of them are eager to act and they are eager to do something. Of course, they find a number of roadblocks. Their business leadership thinking, well, if we talk about this, it's going to sound like we are against the government, and then we're going to get in trouble. Or, if we talk about this thing, how much is that going to cost, right? And especially in times of COVID-19, where we are trying to preserve as much resources as we can. So how can HR sort of promote this conversation in the workplace, knowing that very often when HR wants to do it, they find a roadblock in their business leaders, which shouldn't be that way, but it happens.
Well, it's so funny that you say that, because as I was listening to the question, I was getting ready to say, I hate to push back and be unpopular, but the reality is most of us know that HR alone cannot do this. And a lot of this, that's why one of my tips on my list of 10 was, if you work in an organization that is not diverse, is not going to be diverse, and your leadership is not supportive, you might need to find another home, and I'm not necessarily saying that to advocate everyone moving, but I just want to have an honest conversation. HR certainly can play a role, certainly, but executive leadership is really going to be instrumental in terms of dictating a lot of the policies that Michael was talking about, a lot of the systemic changes, a lot of the issues. HR is a partner, HR might be a facilitator, but at the end of the day, there needs to be some honesty in terms of who is the leadership of this organization and where is this organization going? So also to the previous comments about, these companies are tripping all over themselves now to issue these statements. To be honest, I'm a little sick of, getting all these statements. So also, I think you need to be careful. Statements without action, particularly if we can all go on websites right now and look up. I'm not going to start naming names, but there are lots of companies who've, put out these statements and said they're going to donate all this money, but we look at their boards and their boards are all white, or their executive team is all white. So I think people need to be really, really careful, because a lot of these statements are exposing hypocrisy. So, and that doesn't mean that you can't progress and advance from wherever you are, because I'm fundamentally a believer that you can absolutely move forward. But there are certainly organizations that are tripping all over themselves to get these statements out, and then are essentially going to return to business as usual. So one of my recommendations would be, do not issue a statement without a clearly defined list of actionable objectives. What are the metrics? You asked me that question before about what HR leaders should do. Let's define some metrics, okay? Because we all know what gets measured is what gets done. And so let's look and see what the metrics are, and ensure, if we're trying to transition this culture, have we defined metrics that are clearly measurable that help move us in that direction? And then the other thing, I don't want to go on too long. When we talk about metrics, I'm not talking about tokens and quotas and, all that. I'm not talking about just start slapping Black people everywhere. I mean, That's not necessarily going to fix the problem. Be very intentional. Diversity without inclusion is not the solution either. But certainly we've got to look at leadership.
I love something that you said, Dana. Garrison, I'm coming back to you with one question that I have, because you are in a very unique situation in New York City, and I want to ask you a couple of questions about that. But before, I want to say something or highlight something that you just said, Dana, which is, you can start from wherever you are. I mean, yes, you're going to look back and maybe say why some things should have happened in one way and didn't, but you can start from wherever you are. I feel that HR and business leaders very often feel that they don't take action because they will have some level of spotlight to what happened in the past.
Right.
Instead of just saying, yes, I acknowledge that, yes, our executive board was just white people or just men, maybe not even just white, but all men. And now we acknowledge all these things and we got to move forward from here. And I love that you say that, because it's encouraging to let people know that we are all in a learning process right now, and we're all trying to build and reframe our organizations to do the right thing. And that means it is from right now going forward. That doesn't mean that, we don't look back. It means, start looking forward, right? And taking action to change things.
And let me just say one thing just to piggyback on that. That's really the net of my message as a follow-up to the article, because I feel so many people are struggling, and in particular, white people feeling like, well, if I can't do the perfect thing, I won't do anything.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly, this is a highway. Everybody can pick a lane. It's like your lane might be different from someone else's lane, or you might be starting further back. As far as I'm concerned, if you were a white supremacist yesterday and you decide today, I'm no longer going to be a white supremacist, that's progress. Okay, I'm not necessarily expecting that you've read 5 books and you can quote Kendi and and all that, but it's just deciding that you're not going to do nothing. You are going to do something, and you are going to take action.
Love it. Love it. Love that. Garrison, I want to turn it over to you by quoting Dana again. HR sometimes feels that if they cannot do something perfect, they don't do anything. And that kind of is a pretty mediocre thinking, if you will, because, in the world of agility and fast changing everything, you got to put stuff out there that work, right? You are in the middle of a lot of things going on in your organization. First of all, you are in New York City, which is the epicenter of, the pandemic in America. And in addition to that, now we are, of course, facing the virus of discrimination. And I mean, we were facing it before, but now it's, way more public, and we're taking action about it. How are you working with your executive leadership team and your people to allow them to take action, but also vent, if you will, because, we're dealing with so much right now: coronavirus, racism, 40 million people unemployed, recession, and, the government not doing the right thing. So how are you helping people to find a way to either talk among themselves, vent, whatever it is, while taking action to do the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult, kind of difficult and exhausting thing to do at work. One of the things that we've kind of experienced, and to Shane's earlier point, like one of the main reasons why this conversation was able to be amplified was due to the exhaustion, due to the how tired we were of the virus, of unemployment, of the rise of everything going on. And then this to happen, despite the fact that our world had kind of stopped, the fact that racism still exists even when we're socially distant from one another, I think really did cause this to be amplified. And so I think the good news about that internally is that that exhaustion has caused the need for conversations to happen. And I think it's eliminated some of the fear of saying the wrong thing and kind of assuming positive intent and really trying to move the ball forward. I think, as a queer individual in Pride Month, one of the things I'm also tasked with is, obviously I was planning a lot of Pride initiatives internally, and a lot of the executives have kind of had this idea, and I think it's something on the topic of kind of posting Black Lives Matter, and then kind of what else do we do past that as an organization. I think a lot of organizations are now asking, like, do we cancel Pride? Do we cancel this external event we were planning? Do we just cancel everything? And I think that's the wrong approach. Personally, I think actually shifting your Pride initiatives to talk about Black queer people and Black trans lives, and talking about the topics of intersectionality. I actually did a panel last week about how Pride in marketing was shifting as a result of COVID. And that had been planned for a month, and I actually shifted it entirely to talk about not only amidst COVID, but how are you going to talk about Pride? And if your brand had been rainbow washing in the past and just tacking on a rainbow logo and doing corporate outreach, I think it would be unjust to just stop that because we're now talking about Black lives. I think now actually it's important that you talk about Black queer lives and actually discuss the topic of intersectionality. So I think the right approach, and this is something I'm pushing my executives, particularly in the PR marketing space, is don't cancel your event. Actually, I challenge you to make that event more inclusive and actually talk about the subject matter at hand. So if you were going to do a marketing event about what marketing's like in COVID, okay, great. What is marketing like in a system of racism? And what are brands now challenged to do if they're going to want to talk about Black Lives Matter? how are brands going to tackle that internally? How are they going to deal with their board being white, or their board lacking diversity? So I think challenging everyone to not just stop the world as a result of this conversation, but actually challenge them to do what's actually harder, which is look at the world in what it actually is, and look at America for what it actually is, and the world around us for what it actually is, and applying that to the conversation you're having. So I think it's easier to say, let's put this on hold because we're dealing with the issue of racism. And I think it's actually more challenging to say, no, let's actually talk about racism as it relates to this conversation. So I think it's challenging people to do that, which I think has been almost harder to do, has been something that I've really been pushing for and against, because I think it's easier to really say, well, let's just hold on that.
Yeah.
And it's much harder to say, no, let's actually talk about it in a different lens.
That's fantastic, Garrison. And thank you for bringing that up, and because it's taking even further responsibility, to become really, really inclusive. Even if you were missing the mark.
Yeah.
When you were
and then just one final point while I have the stage. I think it'd be remiss that we have this conversation and not mention SHRM. I have been vocal on my social media, and I will continue to be vocal. And I think it is on white HR leaders to be vocal, who tout their certifications online, who put it on their LinkedIn name. If you are not responding to the fact that SHRM has had distasteful, if not racist, responses to this crisis as it relates to talking about police families and how HR people can provide police families with relief as it relates to them selling their products on comments about racism in the workplace, I think they have been shown time and time again that they are not the organization to lead HR, that they are not the organization to be the forward leaders in the HR community. And so I would just say, really take a look if you're an HR member or a SHRM member, really take a look at that organization. And I would encourage you to challenge them to think broadly if they're going to continue to exist and attempt to be the thought leader in the HR space. And I applaud Enrique, and I have done it privately, and I will continue to do it publicly, the work of Hacking HR to really actually take this conversation and amplify it, and not necessarily just talk about a way to solve it internally. So I've just been very hurt and or angered by SHRM's response as it relates to this. And I just think it's important in this conversation to also talk about that, because as we gather as HR people, if we're doing it in a place like SHRM that is not handling the conversation appropriately, then we're not really doing the work that I think is necessary at this time.
I thank you so much for bringing that up. And, to that end, I just want to say one thing. There's research that shows that anywhere between 50 and 80% of employees do not trust of the work of HR. And the reality is that the overwhelming majority of the people that I meet with in HR, they are people of good heart trying to do the right thing. And we find two big roadblocks: business leaders who are not championing the right causes in the workplace, and our public representation out there, right, that is sending a message that is in contradiction with the things that we believe individually, if you will. So I celebrate mentioning that because, I think that we got to take action as HR, even when our representation or when those that have taken the representation of HR may seemingly not be doing so. So thank you so much for bringing that up, Garrison. We have just a couple of minutes to end our panel. This has been this conversation on the panel before, powerful conversations. I think my mistake was not to schedule more time with you because there's so much to talk about and it's so complex. I mean, look at all the interrelated things that are happening here. We just talked about Pride Month in the middle of a pandemic and Black Lives Matter. That just that one thing is already complex in itself to think about how we connect all these dots. So given the complexity of the reality we are going through, and the conversation that we need to bring to the table of HR, I just want to ask you very briefly to maybe say two things, one or two actionable insights that you can tell HR people to start doing right at this very second. Those actionable insights, they don't need a lot of work, it's just like making them happen. So a couple of things very briefly that you can leave our HR community with to start working on. Anybody?
I'll start. So let's bring it back to the human side of this. I know for the last several minutes, we've been talking about all the things as leaders that we can do, but remember, employees are humans and Black folks are having some challenges. One of the things that I would suggest immediately is making sure that you create some sort of a safe space for Black folks to have that conversation at work about what they're doing. There, as you mentioned, there's so much to unpack. There's a lot of layers. We are seeing some of our white counterparts throwing guilt our way, their personal guilt. We've got to ingest that. We have to also show up to work, go to Zoom calls, and continue, helping to advance the mission of the organization. So for me, I think that immediately one thing you can do, and I mean truly a safe space call, where folks can say what they want to say and not feel like there will be some repercussions as a result of it.
Fantastic, powerful. Who else wants to jump in?
Yeah, just real quick, a couple things. It can be overwhelming to try to solve the world's problems from your position in HR. And I think it's important to recognize that while you want to contribute to that, stay focused on what you can make a difference in today. You can make a difference in every interaction you have, to Liz's point around creating a safe space. To Shane's point earlier, if your company's going to put out a PR message, but on the back end of this, you've got EEOC complaints, you've got internal complaints that never make it to the EEOC, you've got all kinds of things going on, get in there and help solve those issues. Help do your job, because there's a reason why people look at HR and don't think that it matters to the degree it should. So I would encourage everyone to, number one, focus on your job and focus on relationships. Relationships are so important. It's not just about activity, and it's about programs. And too often in HR, we want to get credit for stuff and rolling things out and what this group does and that group. Build relationships with people, because you'll change hearts through those relationships. When somebody feels valued as a person and heard and respected, then they're going to be much more adept to being honest with you, being authentic, and then coming together and helping solve those problems. And that's something that all of us can do every day. There's going to be a new issue 2 months from now. There's going to be 1, 2 months after that. There's going to be a lot of stuff. Make a difference every day. You can do this, and we have to do this. Because if we don't do these things right, then it just creates the environment for other stuff to not be done effectively. So, show up, do your best, make a difference where you are today, and then do that tomorrow, and then do that every day, and that can help drive change.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Powerful. Dana, I know you wanted to.
I was just also going to say, just being really practical, I would say, approach this with creativity and innovation, just the same way, a business would approach, any issue. Yes, it's great to provide a list. We know education is going to be a huge component. And again, this is both and, not either or. But, from an education perspective, in addition to providing, the list of resources, sponsor a Eyes to the Prize showing for a lunch and learn. And then it's not just showing the movie, but it's showing it to a mass audience and then facilitating natural, organic conversation afterwards. I'm so afraid sometimes when we put these lists out and then we're leaving it up to them to actually purchase a book, read a book. I mean, when we talk about trying to get, this out to the masses, we're going to have these lunch and learns and these sorts of events, but think about creative ways to ensure that people really are becoming educated. And then certainly that's not the only issue, but just be creative in your approach.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you. Garrison?
Yeah, I would just say, these issues that we face in HR are not mutually exclusive with racism and with things of that nature. So as it relates to, as I mentioned with Pride, like COVID, Black lives and systemic racism and pride are not mutually exclusive. And so I think challenge yourself with everything that you do to really think through, if you're going to start going through, your harassment complaints, if you're going to start going through, your events that you're doing externally or internally, if you're going to start looking at, your employee handbook or your parental leave, as Michael mentioned. There's so many different things that you're going to start going through over the next 6 to 12 months as it relates to COVID anyway. just make sure that you're also looking at it with the lens of systemic racism and keep this conversation front of mind. They're not mutually exclusive, that actually this should frame your focus in everything that you're doing. COVID was already going to do that anyway, as your workplace probably shifts remote, or as this new world of whatever it is settles into its new normal. So I think it's just really important to keep this front of mind, because yes, this movement is topical, and I do agree with Shane that I think it's going to be this Me Too style of a movement where it then shifts to business, and all of a sudden leaders are going to get complaints filed against them, companies are, and it's really going to snowball from there, which I'm excited for because I think it's necessary. But I just think that this conversation, though it might die out in the media, as some new fad passes our way, I think it will be topical. And I think it's important for us to really continue to focus our own view as it relates to this. And just remember, these aren't mutually exclusive conversations, that it's all relevant.
Thank you, Garrison. Thank you. Shane?
Sure. I want to make sure to lift up what Elizabeth shared about creating safe spaces for Black employees to gather, to mourn, to just be cared for. And if in your organization that doesn't exist, prioritize partnering with an organization. I'm a consultant. I even facilitated for my organization a community care for Black employees. And I wrote a really nice note. And one of my colleagues said, I saw Black, I clicked yes. And I said, well, I'm glad to hear. So we can definitely do some of that work. Additionally, I have different tasks for different people. If you are an HR leader with control over resources and how people are directing their time and the like, what I need you to focus on is really upskilling around a systems lens and an intersectional lens to drive policy, impact assessment, and get some of the outstanding work that people are like, how did you put this statement out there and you haven't done this? Get that done. Right. And we know that power holders can drive the conversation beyond the newsreel. Yep. So I need power holders to do that. And if you're an individual contributor in HR, I need you to be thinking about what are you going to advocate for, and how are you going to really focus on some of the relationship building interpersonal pieces, and then also the data tracking to what Dana mentioned around what gets measured gets tackled. Organizations really need to sort of make sure that if they don't have a measurement system in place, get it together ASAP, because that's also going to help us continue this conversation beyond when the news cycle shifts to something else.
That is powerful. Thank you so much for that, Shane. And just before letting everybody go, first of all, of course, I want to thank you for your generosity and your powerful insights today to talk about this critical conversation that we need to have not only on the streets, but at home and in the workplace. So Liz, Shane, Garrison, Dana, and Mike, thank you so much for being with us today. Everybody who's been